Hey, um, welcome back to Black Psychological Perspectives here at Oakwood University. Today we'll be discussing health issues and disabilities from Chapter 12, as well as psychosocial adaptation and mental health, Chapter 13, in Allison's and Belgrave's book, African American Psychology. Um, Per our usual custom here at Oakwood University, I'll start with a prayer and then we'll get into the discussion here. Dear Lord, thank you for this opportunity to discuss Black psychological perspectives on issues that are important to all of us, our health and our ongoing understanding of who we are and how to be well in the mind, body, and spirit. Thank you for your many blessings. Amen. All right. So, again, vocabulary. And we have a few vocabulary words here, but we'll start with health psychology. It's a field in and of itself. There are a few programs around the country that focus specifically on health psychology and kind of a connection between the mind and the body, but understanding how our health is impacted by how we think and believe and perceive, right? HIV, right? And I'm having definitely my students look up this definition, HIV as well as AIDS. That's definitely a thing that would be on the quiz. The WHO, right? And the H stands for health, and I'll let folks figure out what the other two are. I don't want to give them too much pub. The CDC, Center for Disease Control. The ACA, right? The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as well. And differentiating between morbidity and mortality, we did some of that in the last lesson, but morbidity having to do with disease rates, mortality having to do with death rates, right? Obesity is another term that's been more in use, but also you see many people writing grants about addressing obesity. Another term that happens not just in the school setting related to testing, but also can happen related to which doctor or which person I'm going to see, and that term is stereotype threat. Right. Next, a few other ideas that should be closely related to psychology, even 200 level textbooks. The health belief model and the belief in what it takes for me to be healthy, right? Also, there's a theory of planned behavior as well as self-efficacy beliefs. All right, and those three kind of go together, but gives us an idea of how to begin to address some of these things, or at least some theories. Right, clinical trials. Right, you often hear in commercials, and only when I'm in LA do I hear a lot of requests for people to come and do clinical trials, and it's usually on radio stations that are targeted towards African Americans or other minority groups. A lot of hip hop stations, a lot of R&B and soul stations, even a few jazz stations, but not too many. Jazz isn't always targeted to black folks, although there may be a lot of black folk playing jazz. That's a whole nother topic. Stigma, right? And there's definitely stigma associated with mental health and healthcare in general sometimes for black people for many different reasons. Another term that the book refers to, but I first heard from Dr. Bobby Wright in relation to white psychopathology and black people's reaction to that, right? And menticide, meaning that we're out to ultimately destroy a group's mind, but nonetheless with the ultimate destruction of their race, leading to a genocide. But it begins with a menticide, right? And the last term is misorientation, as opposed to disorientation, which is providing something to put you in the wrong direction. Misorientation completely misses what you are trying to orient your group to. Okay, so that's our vocabulary. We're moving on to some of the leading causes of death among African Americans. Again, we're talking about mortality rates. So the top 6 leading causes of death are cardiovascular disease, stroke. We recently saw, someone who really influenced my life you know, with his films Boys in the Hood, Baby Boy, Rosewood. My fraternity brother, John Singleton, has suffered a stroke more recently. As I mentioned last video, I suffered from hypertension. My parents also suffer from diabetes, right? And we likely know more people than we think we know who suffer from HIV and AIDS. And number 6 is homicide. So again, cardiovascular disease, stroke, hypertension, diabetes, HIV and AIDS, homicide. These are the leading causes of death among African Americans. The book says that each are influenced by lifestyle and behavioral factors and possibly genetic. So a combination of all those three. However, there's a great deal of literature on individual and community-based interventions. So more can and should be done politically and structurally for states as well as the nation in relation to these issues. Some of these models and theories to address have to do with how people perceive healthcare, right? And the connection that they have to whether it's governmental healthcare, whether it's private healthcare, whether it's homeopathic or alternative or natural healthcare, whatever it is. What's our belief model? I'm going back to that vocabulary word, the health belief model. So one of the oldest ideas that's been at least documented within the Western world, developed to explain public participation in screening programs and predict behavior, right? Like whether or not people will exercise, whether or not they'll follow a diet, whether or not they'll come to an exam, whether or not they'll take their meds or follow up with appointments. People who perceive a severe health threat or feel susceptible to a disease are motivated to make a behavioral change, but people who don't perceive that threat may not make that change. And that's a part of that health belief model. The theory of planned behavior, and again, these are broader psychological theories as applied to healthcare. One's ability to perform a certain behavior is the best predictor of that behavior. So if you get the people practicing a behavior, so before you leave the doctor's office, if you have to give yourself a shot, you want to practice that shot, right? These are determined by the attitudes towards the behavior and beliefs about the norms, right? And also, is your family or other people going to be supportive if you're engaging in this behavior that's health-wise, particularly when it comes to exercise or when it comes to a change of diet? So these things are important. I would even add like whether or not someone's going to see a psychologist. What's the family belief related to that? The last piece is the self-efficacy theory, and self-efficacy again is like how effective do I think this may be, or I can be at following this health prescribed plan, and it has to do with one's capability to perform a task that will predict one's success at completing the task. So these are 3 broader healthcare theories that were brought out by the text: health belief model, theory of planned behavior, and the self-efficacy theory. Some other things to consider in relation to racism and health. Racism and health. Perceived discrimination by medical providers is associated with poor medication compliance among African Americans with hypertension, right? These are different studies that have come out that have shown this. Implicit bias against African Americans by white medical providers has been shown, especially related to pain management, right? Black people have long been perceived to be able to endure more pain, but sometimes people don't think that their pain is indicative of a broader problem. And this is one of the theories that's related to the mortality rates of Black mothers. Right. Perceived or actual discrimination can raise a person's heart rate. I've given presentations on this because I've just been aware, and I've read other studies about perceived or actual discrimination changing heart rates, and how people can respond to those, right? Before the word was said or before the issue came up, you were at a certain vibrational resonance with your heart rate, with your breathing, and then once the incident happens or once the perceived slight occurs, the regulation changes, right? There's also institutional type concerns that may be related to food choices, proximity to liquor stores, smoking ads, etc. So poverty by design has led to racialized consequences, right? For example, some males living in the poorest state had, and I'm talking a poorest state in the United States, had a life expectancy of 10 years less than those living in the wealthiest state in the United States. African Americans tend to be overrepresented in involuntary commitment, right? If someone is going to lock them away, they're overrepresented in being locked away due to mental health issues. Also, African American students are more likely to be identified with ADHD, but if we look at socioeconomic status, they were proportionally represented. So it begs the question, is ADHD more based upon poverty and some of the challenges that may come as a result of living in poverty? So the next conversation that the book was going towards was in regards to racial trauma, which racial trauma may result in racial harassment, and it may result from witnessing racial violence or experiencing institutional racism. Again, harassment, witnessing racial violence, or experiencing institutional racism. So the trauma may result in experiencing, and these are the symptoms that may result out of witnessing harassment, violence, or direct or indirect institutional racism. So the resulting trauma could, and these are symptoms or indicators, right? Depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, feelings of humiliation, poor concentration or irritability. No one's really linked microaggressions, well, other than the stereotypes threat studies, microaggressions to how students perform on academic tasks. But I can only imagine if a group of students or young people are experiencing racial trauma, all these pieces may be coming into play. Poor concentration, for one, again, may also be another reason why the ADHD diagnosis is so high. But these feelings of humiliation and low self-esteem may keep a student from even starting. Irritability makes it difficult to even sustain attention when you're trying to hear directions from someone who may be the cause and source of your racial trauma. I've seen too many stories over the last 2 years even of teachers who are doing things that are racially traumatizing, or at the worst, and at best they're just woefully ignorant about black people's lives. Racial trauma with repeated exposure can lead to increased vigilance and suspension, increased sensitivity to threat, increased psychological and physiological symptoms, and may also lead to increased alcohol and drug usage, increased aggression, and a narrowing sense of time on this earth, where my mortality has become paramount, and I wonder if I'll make it through another day. I think of one of my favorite songs by the Ghetto Boys, "My Mind's Playing Tricks on Me." All right. So how do we cope with racial trauma? Well, we affirm and acknowledge that it has actually happened. We affirm other people for surviving and being resilient. We create a space for race, or even a brave space to discuss such things. We rely on storytelling about this racial narrative that may have happened to people who've experienced racial trauma. We validate as well, and we name, the pain or the circumstance. And sometimes this was not a name to it. We may need to go to another language, particularly an African language, for those Africans who are watching, or for those of African descent, to name the pain or circumstance. One comes to mind is the Maafa, and Marimba Ani has done a great job, an amazing job with her book Urugru, helping us catalog the many facets of life and the ways in which racism can take a hold and control and ultimately ruin people's lives, but as well how to overcome racism. But sometimes, again, as I said many times, you need new vocabulary to begin to do that. You don't have to internalize devaluation. You can externalize the devaluation. Realize these events do not and should not lower one's self-worth. You're more than whatever has been said, particularly when there were lies being told about whether or not black pilots could fly. We know the Tuskegee Airmen did more than just fly, but they saved countless lives, and they were willing to give their own. All right. There's other things that we need to do is counteract this devaluation and find ways to value one another, right? And we can rechannel our rage in doing good work to help others. So we have so many different ways to address our own well-being, right? And I'm looking specifically in the book that we have here, and this is the book we've been using, African American Psychology, here on page 379. And you'll give me a moment to get right back to it, but on page 379, the dimensions of African American psychological health are the following: our ideological beliefs, right? Go into a sense of spirituality, a belief in God, a higher power, right? A strong cultural identity and a strong cultural heritage are important. The next is our moral worth, showing self-respect, positive self-esteem, right? Honesty, taking responsibility, having true compassion for other people. The next is our interpersonal style, right? Communicating and interacting well with others to develop and maintain healthy relationships within that interpersonal style, but also being assertive and not reactive, right? And owning what we say and having respect for ourselves and others' feelings as we do so. Next is competence, right? Intelligence, but also being flexible and resilient enough to get the job done, but also to survive whatever onslaught that may be coming. Next is determination, being determined and demonstrating the capacity for willpower and self-control, including being goal-oriented. Next is unity, managing or possessing a sense of inner peace, having good self-knowledge and understanding and striving to do one's best within oneself, but also with others. And finally, our health and physical well-being, taking care and being in good physical health, including diet, one's appearance, and one's own sense of beauty. Also in Africa, those who have higher levels of self-stigma are more likely to believe a mental illness is caused by supernatural forces. The balance is, as we begin with our ideological beliefs, it's important for us to see that if we do believe in these spiritual forces, or we do believe in higher ideals, that these higher ideals, that these spiritual forces, these ideas can help us overcome these challenges. Again, as we were talking about previously, it's important for us to know that we can overcome. Resilience is extremely important. Right, so what are the interventions that we should strive towards that can help us, right? So reducing HIV and AIDS through condom usage and other information campaigns can help reduce stigma and inform others, right? Exercise and diet changes are the best ways to prevent one of the common causes of death for Black people, and that is preventing diabetes through exercises and diet changes. The Association of Black Psychologists has years of research, but they also have a directory of psychologists in each state, right? The APA Minority Scholarship and Fellows, they study issues that impact Black people and other minorities, but particularly related to drug and alcohol issues. APA guidelines for work with minorities, and specifically Black people. Too often mental health providers don't even know about those things. So if you're going to a mental health provider or working with one, it's good to ask them, are they aware of the APA guidelines? The National Institute to Address Minority Health Disparities is another good resource. And it's also good to be aware of cultural competence and or implicit bias training, at least according to the books. And these are some interventions that are out there. I just wanted to add and pose a few questions before we close, right? And these questions, after viewing, that came to my mind were, as an adult, when do you know it's time to go to the doctor? When will you know it's time to go, right? When would you refer a friend or family member for counseling or therapy? Also, what role does the church play in healing from illness? And how can the church be a support or barrier to mental wellness? What is your family narrative about healthcare? And what are your beliefs and actions related to mental health? Right? I hope we've been able to expand your knowledge base. I hope your beliefs support or at least allow you the flexibility to learn and to grow. Because when it comes to our health, things are constantly evolving and changing because we live in a dynamic environment known as the planet Earth. And it's good for us to at least be aware of who we are and where we're from. So often as Americans, particularly as African Americans, we're clueless as to where we're from and what's best for us. It's good to take some time to think about that deeply. All right. That's it for this time. Looking forward to our final chapter, which will be over chapter 14 and 15, but our final video series. Looking forward to that.